Thank you, and thank you everyone for listening to this talk. Although we had a really nice intros, I'll leave all of you to say one sentence about yourself so everyone gets to know you a little bit better. We'll start with Eva.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Eva from 3VC, investing in the post-product market fit stage in CE and DACH primarily.
Hey everyone, my name is Radu. I am a software engineer turned venture investor. I've been with Notion for around 5 years, and we're a B2B specialist fund based out of London. We invest in Europe with a hope of backing the next generation of global companies.
Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Márk, and I work for Portfolion, which is a $500 million asset under management, Central Eastern Europe focused, multi-stage venture capital and growth equity fund manager. At Portfolion, I lead the pre-seed seed stage operation.
Great. Well, we were chatting outside, and we kind of divided the panel in two parts. Márk with the early stage and seed investing, and Radu and Eva in a little bit of a Series A to B approach. So we'll start from the get-go. I'll also do a little bit of a show of hands for companies here who has hired a salesperson at this moment. Do you have salespeople in your team? Okay, we have 3 hands. Okay, so most of these founders here are founder-led salespeople. So let's start with that, Márk. You told me that you often discourage companies for hiring salespeople. Why is that, and what do you think this is a good approach?
Yeah, it feels like it is the job for us. We are usually first check investors into very interesting value propositions or ideas. On very interesting markets. And I think in the first year, it's extremely important for founders to remain as close to customers or potential customers as possible, because there's just so much data point there that they can learn about what would resonate with them in terms of how the product should look like, how pricing should be, and it's just not something that they can outsource. I think up until around the first 10 customer or 1 million ARR, sales needs to really stay with founders. And I think especially here in Central Eastern Europe, where the technical talent is really strong, and there are lots of founders who really enjoy the technical aspect of building a company, it might be something that would be natural to do, to outsource the sales part to someone who's more seasoned in that. But it's just a temptation that is really worth resisting, and we're trying to encourage founders to resist the temptation and keep sales to themselves.
So when would be a good moment to actually start considering hiring? And does it depend on the average contract value of the customers? Like, is this startup targeting enterprises or SMBs? What do you think about it, Márk?
Yeah, so as I said, I think it depends based on the model, right? Whether it is B2B or B2C. But I think, and we mainly invest into enterprise software and so B2B, and there the rule of thumb that we try to follow is first 10 customers and first 1 million ARR, which is also about the time when a company becomes ready to raise a Series A round, and we can involve, if you're lucky to invest into teams that can build interesting things, then it is also a time where Radu or Eva would come into one of our companies.
Speaking of Eva, so at that point, and obviously like in later rounds, you have to discuss with founders about right hires. How do you help them actually find right sales leaders, and how involved are you in this process?
So I think it's very important that founders understand that hiring that very shiny profile that looks great on LinkedIn is not necessarily the silver bullet that they are hoping for. I think what we have seen in our portfolio is that it's so important to hire the first, I think first you actually would hire the first salespeople, right? And you should always hire 2 or 3 so that at least you can benchmark and know whether somebody is performing. And in reality, you probably will end up with one or two of those that will work. Best case, all three are great, but that's very unlikely to happen. But we really advise to hire somebody that can roll up the sleeves, doesn't expect that there is a big support function providing you the perfect sales material and so on, but you actually need people that do the hands-on. And yes, we as investors then might get quite involved by activating our network or joining the interview process, sometimes helping to sell the opportunity to those sales leaders, right? Or sometimes also trying to validate them. But yeah, I think like one key takeaway is just don't hire for the shiny profile. It most often doesn't work. But first, before you actually look for this head of sales or VP of sales, whatever is the title, I think first, normally you would hire a few salespeople and manage them as a founder. And when you get too busy doing that, and when you need more sales process, sales rigor, I think that's the time when you would hire a team lead or whatever is the seniority at that point of time.
We were chatting earlier about some criteria for you to actually consider an investment in a company. One criteria is actually global approach to sales. So how does that work with founders based in Germany or Eastern Europe, and they need to hire their first salespeople to target the US?
It's tough, because I think for us Europeans, all the American sales guys or girls, they sound amazing. So, they know how to sell themselves. I think it's really important to understand, and in the interviews to ask questions, hey, what is the last thing you built on your own? To really understand how much they would be hands-on. Also give a case study assessment, whatever, test them, and do references. So we have had cases where we interviewed profiles that sounded truly amazing, and then reaching out to other investors that maybe worked with a company where those people were before, you discover things, hey, where they tell you, hey, that's the company you considered to hire that person for, like, be very, very careful, because that person worked great in such a setup, but it didn't work at all for that and that and that. So you discover a lot of reality in those indirect reference calls as well. But you as founders, if you try to work with your investors, because we often help interview those, so we have certain benchmarks as well. And for I think leaders, it's very common to use the search firms. And yes, it might sound crazy to pay 100 or 150,000 to actually hire somebody, but most often it's worth it.
And maybe switching over to you, Radu, you're a software engineer turned investor. How do you feel, or rather, how do you help founders that are technical get used to this role of managing salespeople and looking after the sales process?
I think the beauty of being a founder is that you usually have a team around you, and the reality is that you're never alone. And that team can either be your co-founder or the other people around you that are part of your broader business. The reality is that for technical founders, it's pretty tough to build a go-to-market function by themselves. And that's why it's important to have a co-founder that's more commercial to help you on that journey. When we look at the very first sales hire, one of the very good playbooks we've seen our founders do is that they tend to hire someone relatively junior. This is particularly common when you sell to SMEs. Someone like a founder associate, where you kind of give them stuff to do, stuff that would be ops related or things that maybe take too much of your time as you build the business and the product, and then you help them grow, both as individuals and also across the business as you grow the demand. And looking at your first sales hire as some sort of an ops person where you give them demand and they supercharge your abilities, we find that to be very powerful.
Go ahead.
I just want to add something. I think one trick that has worked very well as well is ask your peers, ask your investors, hey, can you introduce me to a few people that are great in that, that are either great, this founding go-to-market person or a great head of sales, so that you also learn how great looks like, because that's something we very often see, that founders just don't know how great looks like. And talking to 5, 6, 7 people, you also get to feel maybe what you are looking for.
and maybe just to what Eva said, which is very important, I think the definition of great for each function is changing about every 2 years. So once you learned what great means for example, for a VP of sales or head of sales in the early days, it's a very different definition than what you're looking for once you hit the next milestone. I don't know, 10 million ARR, and you're raising your Series B, and you might be looking for a more senior hire who had experience in growing companies from that point on, and manage larger organizations and build processes for that.
Mark, maybe a question for you. Considering your founders are mostly in this founder-led sales mode, a lot of VC firms usually say, we have a lot of connections, we help you with stuff. How often do you come across a case where you can actually introduce founders from your portfolio to potential leads?
I think because of our background, and I didn't mention this in our intro, but we are a subsidiary of OTP Bank, but operate in a very independent manner in terms of what we invest in and which founders we team up with. We usually try to leverage the OTP network, so that's something that we definitely try to tap into. And yeah, whenever we can make an introduction, we do that. I think it's perfectly fine in the early days for founders as well to source the first customers from their network. Those are trusted allies who are maybe a bit more patient, who are willing to spend time with a scrappier version of the product. So yeah, it happens sometimes, but no matter, I mean, even if we make an introduction, it really comes down to the founders to do the magic and do the convincing and for that reason, actually, in the early days, we're not at all against founders finding their first-time customers from their network rather than from someone else's network in their close to them. Yeah, because just as I said, they're a bit more patient, and you can just learn more within that circle.
You mentioned local networks and local markets. We were chatting before this panel how looking at further raising more rounds, you would want to see founders broaden their customer base to other markets and outside their networks. How do you see it, or do you discount local markets when thinking about next investment?
Any revenue is good revenue to begin with. The reality, though, is that US is very different compared to Europe. They tend to buy faster, they tend to be more open to change, and it's a less fragmented market compared to what we have back home. At Series A, we don't discount any local revenue. I think that's foolish. But at the same time, we want each of our companies and founders to build global businesses. And that means that they need to have some sort of demand from outside Europe. We don't have a hard percentage or number in terms of what we expect our founders to have when we invest, either at A or B from Europe or from US, but we want to see some adoption or some proof points that they can expand outside of Europe. Because the reality is, building a company that becomes publicly traded at some point, it's very tough to do if all of your revenue comes from Europe.
Well, Radu, you are based in the UK, so I'm not surprised you don't discount the revenues from the UK. But I think, how we look at this is if the whole revenue would come, let's say, from the Czech Republic or Latvia, where I'm originally come from, I think at Series A that would be quite tough. I think there are a few markets in Europe where you would feel somewhat comfortable if the whole revenue is coming from one country, maybe it's Germany, France, Italy, UK, but you want to see that the founders want to go international, they can actually go international, so I think it's not just black and white.
And maybe, Eva, staying with you, when it comes to these mistakes that founders do in hiring first salespeople, or rather first sales leaders, what are the most costly mistakes?
I think the most costly mistakes are really hiring the wrong person and not letting that person go fast enough. So I think in reality, within 2 or 3 months longest that this is not the right fit. And then often founders get hopeful, maybe it'll work out. Let's give another quarter, and then let's give another quarter. And then it's not just about, you lost 9 months, but you will still probably spend months now hiring the replacement. So trust your gut and let the wrong person go fast. And then the other thing that Mark said, sometimes hiring salespeople too early. During my startup days, when I was on the other side, we also did the mistake. We hired a salesperson before we had a product market fit, before we had the product ready, in a way. That frustrates salespeople, that increases your cash burn. So that was way too early. So hiring too early and then not letting go fast enough the wrong ones.
Maybe on that topic, hiring too early, is it too early? So what are kind of the benchmark in terms of like what is too early? Usually people mention repeatable processes and then scaling sales. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think there should be clear customer interest and the first customers that actually like using the product. And then also you need to be mindful whether you have the pipeline. Of course, it depends on your go-to-market process. And how will the pipeline be generated? Is it marketing-led, so where the salespeople takes over, or is this, you expect the person to do end-to-end process, then also just hiring the right person that can go and also create leads? So yeah, sometimes hiring then salespeople when you actually have no pipeline to give them, and that's something that you should watch out for. So do we have a signs of product market fit, and are we confident there will be pipeline for those salespeople in one way or another? The rest you can, I think, improve, build on the go, be it, the contracts, billing, and so on. Maybe you want to add something to that?
I think another thing that's usually very valuable is don't assign senior titles for as long as possible. We see it very common, especially with slightly technical founders, going back to your first question, on assigning the CRO title between the seed and the A or between the A and the B. Mark previously touched upon this, which is what great looks like to you now will be very different compared to what great will be to you in 2 years from now. And the more you can push senior titles, either CROs or VP sales or maybe even head off, keep pushing them out, because once you assign them to someone, they're very tough to take away from them.
Mark, you can touch on that, but I'll also ask you if there is value in like founder networks that you create as an investor. Do founders talk about sales a lot, at least in your portfolio?
We definitely try to facilitate those conversations and put founders in touch who are 1 or 2 steps ahead of another team, and then share learnings. That's definitely something that we try to facilitate. But just adding to the previous question, one more thing. I think it's good to discuss the first sales executive or the first sales leader that you hire, and the CRO should definitely come in at a much later point than what would perhaps come to people's mind first. But even a VP of sales or a head of sales shouldn't be the first hire of any founders. I think first off, at least the framework that we saw worked the best is to hire like a full-fledged salesperson that has experience both in generating leads and also closing deals. At that point, the founder should still be very closely involved in the sales process, but create some leverage for him or herself. And then after that, adding an SDR, so this full-fledged salesperson creates some leverage for him or herself. And then, thank you. And then once there are about 5 or 6 of those individuals, and it becomes a bit difficult to manage it as an organization, then it comes to hiring your first sales executive, and then it should be a head of sales max, and definitely not a larger title.
Thank you so much.